the real economics of owning a cruise ship. So you want to own a cruise ship, build a floating resort, pack it with vacationers, sell them drinks, and watch the profits roll in. It sounds almost too easy. People have been running this playbook for generations, and the global industry pulled in $71 billion in revenue in 2024 alone. Surely there's room for one more? There is. There's always room. The real question is whether you can stay solvent long enough to enjoy it. Let's start with what you're actually buying because most people underestimate it completely. A modern cruise ship isn't a boat, it's a city. A self-contained floating metropolis that generates its own electricity, manufactures its own drinking water, treats its own sewage, feeds thousands of people 3 times a day, entertains them non-stop, and crosses open ocean while doing all of it simultaneously. Take Royal Caribbean's Icon of the Seas, launched in January 2024, nearly 1,200 feet long, 20 decks, 18 of them for guests, capacity for up to 7,600 passengers, with a crew of 2,350, larger than the population of most small towns. Laid on its side, it would come close to matching the Empire State Building in length. On board, guests find roughly 40 restaurants and bars, a Broadway-style theater, an ice rink, 6 water slides, including the first suspended infinity pool ever installed at sea, a hospital, a shopping mall, a casino, satellite internet, and enough kitchen output to feed about 10,000 people 3 meals a day. The price tag to build it, $2 billion, not a typo. And that's simply the cost of entry at the top tier of this business. Drop down a size class and a mid-size ship runs $600 to $900 million. Even a small luxury vessel built for a few hundred wealthy guests still costs $400 to $500 million. In this industry, cheap is relative and small is still enormous. But the sticker price is almost a footnote because the purchase isn't where operators go broke. Long before a single passenger boards, before a single drink is sold, money is already flowing out the door. First, financing. Almost no cruise operator pays cash. They borrow typically over 12 to 15-year terms with interest accruing from day one. A $2 billion ship like Icon of the Seas generates tens of millions in annual interest before a single guest checks in. Second, registration. You'll notice that despite being headquartered in Miami, virtually no major cruise line flies an American flag. Royal Caribbean, Disney, Norwegian, over 200 ships in this industry are registered in places like the Bahamas, Panama, or Bermuda. Why? Lower taxes, lighter regulation. It's called a flag of convenience, and it saves these corporations millions every year that would otherwise go to the U.S. Treasury. The catch, as we'll see later, is that when disaster strikes and you need a government to step in, the government whose flag you're flying often has little capacity to help. Third, crew costs. A ship like Icon employs 2,350 people, engine room technicians, cooks, cabin stewards, many recruited from the Philippines, Indonesia, and Eastern Europe on 8 to 10-month contracts, often without a single day off. Their pay would violate U.S. labor law, but it's entirely legal under the ship's flag state. Entry-level positions, cleaners, dishwashers, can pay as little as $400 to $700 a month for 11-hour days, 7 days a week. Financial outlet. The hustle dug into the contracts and found a mandatory minimum of 308 hours a month, which works out to somewhere between $1.62 and $2.27 an hour. None of this is hidden. It's simply how the math works once you've registered offshore instead of in Florida. Lower taxes cascade into lower allowable wages and lighter oversight throughout the whole cost structure. Now the bill that arrives every single morning before breakfast is even served. Royal Caribbean's own published figures put annual operating costs for a megaship like Icon of the Seas at roughly $355 million, about $920,000 a day, every day, whether the ship is full or sitting empty at the dock. Where does that money actually go? Fuel is the single largest cost after labor. A large ship burns 150 to 250 tons of fuel a day underway, and at $500 to $600 a ton, That's $75,000 to $150,000 daily just to keep the engines turning. This is exactly why these ships cruise at 18 to 20 knots instead of flooring it. Fuel consumption doesn't rise proportionally with speed, it compounds. Food is smaller than you'd expect. Roughly 11% of operating costs, about $13 to $14 per person per day. Across 6,000 guests and 2,000 crew, that's still around $112,000 daily on ingredients alone, kept manageable through massive bulk purchasing that cuts out middlemen entirely. Then there are port fees every time the ship calls somewhere, Nassau, Cozumel, Barcelona, Santorini, which accumulate fast across a year of nonstop itineraries. Add scheduled maintenance. Maritime classification societies require every passenger ship into dry dock twice every 5 years for full inspection, at a minimum of $12 million per visit, with the vessel earning zero revenue for weeks. When Royal Caribbean pulled Liberty of the Seas in for a $100 million refit in April 2025, that ship generated nothing for the duration. And then insurance, hull coverage, passenger liability, environmental protection against fuel spills on a $2 billion asset sailing through hurricane zones, and the premiums aren't small. Stack it all together and a large cruise ship costs somewhere between $800,000 and over $1 million a day just to exist before a single ticket is sold. Here's where most outside observers get the business model backwards. They see a $400 week-long Caribbean cruise and assume either the company is losing money or the ticket is a loss leader they're recouping some other way. They're half right. It absolutely is a loss leader, but the mechanism is more deliberate than people realize. After travel agent commissions pass through port fees and basic cost allocation, that $400 to $500 ticket leaves the company with razor-thin, sometimes negative, margins. The ticket isn't the product, it's the bait. Once you're aboard, you've entered one of the most carefully engineered retail environments ever built. You're in the middle of the ocean with nowhere else to spend money. Thirsty? Buy from the ship. Want Wi-Fi? Buy from the ship. Want a massage, a specialty dinner, a shore excursion, a hand of blackjack? All from the ship. This is what the industry calls onboard revenue, and it's where the real profit lives. Royal Caribbean's 2024 filings make this explicit. 8.56 million passengers, $16.48 billion in total revenue, and roughly 30% of that, $4.3 billion, came not from tickets but from onboard spending. The margins are remarkable. Carnival's all-inclusive drinks package, Cheers, runs up to $90 per person per day, while the wholesale cost of that alcohol is a small fraction of the price. Beverage gross margins routinely exceed 80%. The onboard casino operates largely outside land-based gambling regulation. Spa pricing rivals five-star resorts on land. And because most of this is charged to a preloaded card or wristband, passengers rarely feel like they're spending real money in the moment, a deliberate design choice, not an accident. Royal Caribbean's 2025 data shows nearly half of onboard revenue is now locked in before the ship even leaves port, through app-based pre-purchases of drink packages, dining reservations, and excursions. Guests who pre-book through the app spend 2.5 times more than those who decide once aboard. That's the machine in action. The ticket gets you on the boat, and the boat turns you into a customer. A $500 ticket paired with $800 in onboard spending makes that passenger worth $1,300, more than double the advertised fare. And the cruise lines know this down to the decimal, which is why duty-free shops sit near the gangway, casinos anchor high-traffic corridors, and specialty restaurants cluster around the main atrium. Nothing is placed by accident. Here's the counterintuitive twist. You'd expect a bigger ship to mean bigger cost and bigger risk, and it does. But the cost per passenger actually falls, sometimes sharply, as ships get larger. That's economies of scale, and it's the single biggest reason the industry keeps building vessels larger than anything that came before. Whether you're carrying 2,000 or 6,000 guests, you still need just one bridge crew, one engine room, one theater troupe, one kitchen management structure, one hull to maintain, one set of port contracts. Spread those fixed costs across 6,000 passengers instead of 2,000, and the per-passenger economics transform. Lower cost per head means lower ticket prices, which means more customers, which means more total profit than a smaller operator could ever generate. Industry data bears this out. A typical non-mega modern ship generates $200 to $300 million a year in revenue, with net profit landing between $20 to $40 million. Ships the size of Icon of the Seas, carrying 7,000 plus guests, effectively print money at scale. Royal Caribbean's 2025 adjusted earnings were projected at $14 to $15 per share, a figure most industries would envy. That scale, though, comes with a structural weakness, not a financial one, a systemic one. On February 10, 2013, Carnival Triumph departed Galveston, Texas for a 4-day trip to Cozumel. 4 days later, a fire broke out in the aft engine room, traced to a fuel leak in a diesel generator. It was extinguished automatically with no fatalities, but the electrical damage knocked out power entirely. Air conditioning failed, refrigeration failed, and most infamously, the vacuum system running every toilet on the ship failed. Over 4,200 passengers and crew were left adrift in the Gulf of Mexico. Sewage backed into hallways, waste piled in biohazard bags outside cabin doors. Passengers slept on deck to escape the heat and smell. One told NBC News the conditions felt primitive, others compared it to a zoo. 4 tugboats eventually towed the ship to Mobile, Alabama, a 5-day ordeal. What emerged afterward was worse than the incident itself. Carnival's own maintenance log showed the generator responsible had gone over a year without required service. In the 2 years before the fire, the same ship had experienced 9 separate fuel line leaks. 2 weeks before that final voyage, it had already limped back to port 5 hours late with propulsion trouble. Carnival knew. A federal judge later found the company liable and negligent. The fallout was layered and expensive. Full refunds plus $500 cash plus travel reimbursement plus a free future cruise voucher for every passenger. Confidential settlements across a wave of lawsuits. Over $500 million committed fleet-wide to fire prevention and engine upgrades across all 24 Carnival ships. And the Triumph itself, renamed Carnival Sunrise to shed the association, underwent a $200 million rebuild in Cadiz, Spain. New engines, redundant generators, redesigned sewage lines, upgraded fire suppression. $200 million, traced back to one missed service date on one fuel generator. Nothing in the industry's history, though, compares to what started in March 2020. COVID-19 spread through cruise ships faster and more visibly than almost anywhere else. The Diamond Princess, anchored off Japan in February 2020, became a defining image of the pandemic after roughly 700 passengers tested positive and 9 died. Headlines called these ships floating petri dishes. By March, the CDC's no-sail order halted operations in U.S. waters entirely, and other nations followed. Within weeks, the entire global fleet, roughly 100 ships, sat idle in ports worldwide, earning nothing, costing everything. This is the number that exposes the model's fragility. Carnival Corporation, the world's largest operator, had generated $20.8 billion in 2019, about $57 million a day. In 2020, with almost no revenue, it was burning through $650 million a month. Costs don't pause just because operations do. Ships still need fuel for basic systems. Skeleton crews, insurance, and debt service continues regardless of a global shutdown. Carnival lost $10.24 billion in 2020, averaging $28 million in losses every single day. To stay afloat literally and financially, it raised $19 billion in new debt and equity between March and December, sold ships, scrapped others, and pushed back deliveries already under construction. By 2023, total debt had climbed to $32 billion, up from roughly $12 billion pre-pandemic. Even with profitability restored and record earnings by 2025, debt still sat at $26.8 billion, and interest payments alone consumed $1.35 billion that fiscal year, 6 times what the company paid in interest back in 2019. The industry has come back. Royal Caribbean posted $4.3 billion in profit in 2025. Norwegian and Carnival are both posting record bookings. But that debt and the memory of how close the whole system came to collapse sits underneath every earnings call. Now for the math that actually determines whether this business works. Say your ship carries 6,000 passengers at 108% capacity, achievable because some cabins sleep more than two. Average ticket revenue around $1,344 per passenger yields about $8 million in ticket sales for one sailing. Add onboard spending, drinks, casino, excursions, spa, Wi-Fi, averaging $582 per passenger, another $3.5 million. Total revenue for a single 7-day sailing, $11 to $12 million. Against roughly $7 million in weekly operating costs, that leaves $4 to $5 million in profit per sailing. Run 50 sailings a year and you're looking at $200 to $250 million in annual net income per ship, before interest and corporate overhead. Put another way, a typical ship generating $200 to $300 million in annual revenue nets $20 to $40 million in profit. On a $2 billion asset, that's a 50-year payback period at the low end, or 25 to 30 years for a larger, more efficient vessel. Still an extraordinarily long runway for a depreciating asset. Now picture the bad year. Occupancy slides from 108% to 70%, which happens during recessions, geopolitical shocks, health scares, or a rough hurricane season. A fuel spike adds 20% to energy costs. A mechanical failure pulls the ship from service for 6 weeks. Route cancellations in a key market like the Caribbean or Mediterranean cut revenue 30 to 40%. Costs barely move because they're almost entirely fixed. That $40 million annual profit flips into a $10 to $30 million loss. The swing between a good year and a bad one runs $50 to $80 million. And that gap, not the headline revenue or the fireworks at a new ship's launch, is what actually determines whether this business survives. Royal Caribbean's 2024 numbers illustrate it precisely. Of the $1,926 in revenue generated per passenger, only 17.5%, about $336, became profit. Fine until you see how fast that margin disappears the moment occupancy dips or costs climb. Here's what the vacation brochure never mentions. The companies that thrive aren't the ones who simply built a nice ship and filled it with tourists. They're the ones that have been doing this for decades, with the scale to spread fixed costs across dozens of vessels and tens of millions of passengers, and the negotiating leverage to buy fuel, food, and port access at rates no independent operator could touch. Carnival Corporation, Royal Caribbean Group, and Norwegian Cruise Line Holdings together control roughly 72% of the global market, a textbook oligopoly. They also have something else: private islands. Royal Caribbean spent $250 to $450 million turning a stretch of Bahamian beach into Perfect Day at Coco Cay, technically a port of call on the itinerary, but one where every dollar spent flows straight back to Royal Caribbean, with no local restaurants, no independent tour operators, and no competition whatsoever. Water park access there runs $74 to $189 per person per day. Cabana rentals exceed $1,000. The island is projected to clear over $600 million in direct revenue in 2026. Disney's Castaway Cay paid out more than $220 million in dividends to its parent company between 2014 and 2024, a clear signal of how profitable owned island revenue really is. This is vertical integration at its cleanest. The passenger pays for the cruise, the ship sails to an island the company itself owns, and the company captures every dollar spent there with zero leakage and zero competition. That's the version of this business that actually works. The global cruise industry generated $71 billion in 2024 and is projected to reach roughly $78 billion by 2026. The ships keep growing, the private islands keep expanding, the onboard upsell engineering keeps getting sharper, and every single voyage remains a bet. Fill the cabins, sell the drinks, keep the engines turning, dodge the storms, and hope there's no pandemic. And you can generate extraordinary returns from one of the most capital-intensive business models ever devised. Leave those cabins empty long enough, though, and the ship stops making money and starts consuming it. So the next time one of these floating cities passes on the horizon, a billion-dollar hotel gliding across open water, you're not just looking at a vacation. You're looking at a finely tuned machine built to convert your presence on board into revenue, one voluntary purchase at a time.